You're a good debater and you're not afraid of a fight. So why have your comments off? Just out of curiosity.
Well, I've turned them on for a lot of things.
On your shorts you do.
Right. In some of my lives, I think they're on. But almost as soon as I turn them on, there's photos of my family's homes.
Okay.
What's the address?
Yeah.
And at what point, and I just want to clarify.
Yeah, please.
I don't have to take that abuse.
Agreed.
Like, I don't come to work and slap the dick out of their mouth.
Kind of why do you have a disdain for informants, in your opinion?
I don't disdain them. I downright fucking hate them. That's okay. But see, this is why I can say it. That Jeff's crazy. He's on medication. I have a disdain for them because no man should ever go to prison on the words of another man, number one. Number two, in 90% of the cases you look at, the informant has done more vile and disturbing crap than those that are being accused. Number three, I find it oxymoronic when a man, Joey Merlino, because everybody knows who he is, he goes in front of a judge, they can bring up everything he's ever been accused of, including murders and whatever else. Even though he's acquitted, it doesn't really matter because it's a character judgment. But yet, in that same case, you can't turn that around and say, well, let's judge the rat. Judges don't allow that. So for me, it's like you're walking in, you're already behind.
I'm going to tell you something. If you still never follow me again, I'm telling you, the rest of my life, I ain't getting offensive. I can't. There's good friends of mine out of the well, he's divorced, you have to do it. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the
I believe third installment of the Colombo crime family history. As we did, and listen, I'm only going to go so far with this today because, you know, there's a lot of shit that we're going to be covering when it comes to Carmine Persico. But we have some things in this show today that I don't think anybody's ever heard before. Some of it will be regurgitated stuff. But anyway, as we talked sort of last week, Joe Colombo pulled the coup. He informs Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese of the plans devised by Joe Bonanno and Joe Magliocco. We know that Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese called both Magliocco and Bonanno to a meeting. Bonanno would actually flee to Montreal, leaving basically Magliocco to fend for himself, which is a bitch move. As a result of that, Magliocco was fined and forced to step down from the Mafia, and Joe Colombo would be named new boss of the Profaci crime family, which he would rename the Colombo crime family. On the back end, war had essentially died off as Joey Gallow gets sent to prison in 1961. Colombo would then be the youngest mob boss in the history of the American Mafia and the first American Mafia-born boss. Colombo being 41 at the time of his ascension to boss, well, it really was a big thing. It not only meant because of his age that he would likely outlive and outlast other contemporary bosses, but it would mean the eventuality of controlling the commission. Now, whether or not Carlo Gambino realized that along with Tommy Lucchese is probably something that we could expound on a bit. And I think the question that many of you will ask at some point is whether or not Carlo Gambino played Joe Colombo or not. And I think it's safe to say he did. This was another move designed by Gambino to control the commission. Put someone in charge that you can bend. And I think initially there was a fear about putting Joe Colombo in because he did do Carlo Gambino a favor, let's be honest. But they would soon realize that Colombo wasn't about to be controlled by anybody. So was it a mistake to put Joe Colombo in charge? At the time, probably not, because, you know, the warring was decimating the family and bringing heat to the Mafia, creating a lot of problems. So putting him in charge, albeit initially, wouldn't be the worst decision that was ever made. I don't know if they expected Colombo to become what he ends up becoming. So as Colombo takes over, he begins to shuffle the ranks around. Every boss, when they take over, moves the chess pieces around the board a bit to insulate themselves and stack the deck to their side of the fence. One of the things that Joe Colombo did was place older statesmen of the Mafia into powerful positions within the family. He knew, just as many bosses did, that younger, more eager mobsters had serious ambition. And he didn't want to put anybody in power who could rival him or put him in a position to counteract what he wanted. That's also essentially what Carlo Gambino did as well. One of the reasons that Carlo Gambino closed the books was because he realized that the younger generation didn't understand the past, and he feared that having younger men within the family would have serious consequences, and he would be right. So as Columbo takes over, he would promote and name Salvatore Charlie Lemons Mineo as his underboss and Benedetto D'Alessandro as his consigliere. Sal Mineo came up under the tutelage of Harry and Phil Fontana, who controlled the docks specifically in Red Hook, Brooklyn in the early days. Prior to his promotion, he ran a crew of heavyweights by the likes of Abby Schatz Abitamarco, Anthony Riccardi, Joe Iacovelli, Jimmy Bats Cardello, and Alphonse Lamotte. But they would eventually be transferred over to Carmine Persico. D'Alessandro would step down in 1969 and Joe Iacovelli would take over. What is interesting about that is that it was Gambino's suggestion that Iacovelli take over for D'Alessandro, and Gambino would vouch for him personally. Obviously, Iacovelli wouldn't last long, but whether or not that was a move from the outside in, I couldn't tell you. But it was almost like Gambino sort of saw down the line better than anybody else, really in the history of organized crime. He could predict what would happen. Iacovelli got his start really as a B&E type of guy, having been charged some dozen or more times before the 1950s for a slew of theft type of crimes before joining the Colombo crime family, getting made sometime in the mid-1950s. By all accounts, Iacovelli was ruthless and cunning and wouldn't hesitate to murder to prove a point, which made him a valued member of the Colombo crime family. While there was still bad blood between the Gallo faction and the Colombos, Nicky Bianco and Ray Patriarca would actually step in and cool the waters between the Gallos and the Colombos. If Nicky Bianco and Ray Patriarca hadn't stepped in, they would have kept fighting, at least for the time being. Nicky Bianco, for his role in helping mend the fences, was allegedly and incorrectly, very incorrectly, was made by the Colombo crime family, and that's not absolutely true. I see that posted everywhere, and that's not true, because if you know anything about New England Mafia, the Patriarcha specifically, Nicky Bianco actually was a made guy within the Patriarcha crime family. He ended up actually taking over his boss at one point, but he was sort of the go-between the Colombos and Ray Patriarcha. Bianco would be used, like I said, as a go-between them. And there were some people early on who didn't buy Colombo as boss, and they sort of snickered behind his back about it. Guys didn't like how he became boss, and some viewed that sort of as a rat move, and that he truly didn't earn his wings, so to speak, but nobody would really mention anything really out loud because he was backed by Carlo Gambino, and a lot of people suspected that Carlo Gambino was kind of the puppet pulling the strings when it came to Joe Colombo. And they felt that Colombo was just doing whatever Gambino wanted, but they were definitely wrong about that. If anybody wanted to challenge the notion of Joe Colombo, they probably could have, and rightfully so, but they weren't going to do it because they were afraid of Carlo Gambino. So while Colombo is sort of tying up loose ends, Joey Gallow sits in prison. Gallow would split sentences between 3 different prisons: Greenhaven, Attica, and Auburn. However, once he arrived in Greenhaven, that's when things sort of began to morph for Joey Gallow, and really not for the better. While he was doing his time, like I said, at Greenhaven, he would meet Nicky Barnes, who once he was released would become one of the biggest narcotics traffickers on the planet. Gallow may not have been the most underbracing mobster ever, but he knew enough about the streets, he knew enough about urban areas that he realized eventually the Italians would seek greener pastures and they would leave Harlem. Tony Salerno never left, but he knew that it would probably become, for the most part, an African-American controlled area, especially when it came to narcotics. I mean, he knew that the mob controlled the flow of it, but those that were in Harlem paying the price from the Italians would eventually either attempt to exert control or they would merge together. He knew that their power base, their power would shift at some point, and if anybody wanted to take control of that or anybody wanted to take over, there were ways that it could be done. So while in prison, Nicky Barnes and Joey Gallow talked a lot, and one of the things that Gallow did was he taught Nicky Barnes how to organize and how to structure a criminal crew. He taught him how to insulate himself, how to form the organization. And from the conversations with Gallow, it also led Gallow to sort of begin to think outside the box about who he wanted around him when he got out of prison. Like Lucky Luciano, why stereotype against why stereotype against the Irish or African Americans or Puerto Ricans? Because at the end of the day, it was all about making money together. And Gallo had sort of the idea that it shouldn't matter whether somebody was, Italian, African American, or whatever it would be. And one of the things he considered was putting African Americans in his crew. And that would be something that he knew that the old guard of the Italians would not fucking want under any circumstances. But Gallo didn't care because the bottom line for him was always money and power. In 1964, Gallo caused eyebrows to raise when he sued the Department of Corrections, accusing guards of cruel and unusual punishment at Greenhaven against him after he allowed an African-American inmate to cut his hair. Those were the days, I guess. Nothing would come out of that sort of that lawsuit. But what caused the reaction was a letter that was posted in the New York papers from the warden of the jail that accused Gallo of being a belligerent inmate, an inconsistent agitator. To the outside, his contemporaries looked at this sort of thing as that's a problem. You go to prison, shut your mouth, do your time. Gallo, for his part, as being blatantly outspoken, hadn't changed really at all behind the wall. Word also would trickle out that he was aligning himself in the system with African Americans, which really sort of caused a problem on the streets. It just wasn't something you did. Was it about race? Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to call it any other way, but this was more about the Italians wanted to keep the tradition, and who the fuck is this guy aligning himself with African Americans? And nobody really liked that idea. But Gallo didn't give a fuck. So Columbo would consistently be hounded by the feds, and in 1970 would sort of invent the Italian-American Civil Rights League, specifically after his son Joe was arrested for melting down silver coins. Columbo claimed that the FBI was prejudiced against Italians and consistently harassed Italians due to bigotry. April 30th of 1970, he sent 30 picketers to stand outside the FBI headquarters off 3rd Avenue and 69th Street to protest against the FBI for persecution of Italians everywhere. And the picketing went on for weeks. While many people have argued over the years about whether the Italian-American Civil Rights League, whether that was actually legit or not, I don't think it takes rocket science to see through what Columbo was trying to do. Some are going to tell you that it was a legit league, but I feel like the truth is that it was just another way to deflect Mafia rumors and innuendo and nothing more. At first, and listen, I cannot speak for Carlo Gambino, but I can assume naturally the Mafia didn't like this one bit. They obviously didn't. It was putting the Mafia on Front Street. It was making them visible and was creating a serious fucking headache for the mob. Gambino ended up reaching out to Columbo and pretty much tells him, wind down the fucking rhetoric, shut up. And Columbo didn't want to stop. To follow that up, Columbo then went on national television. He was doing interviews, radio interviews, lambasting the FBI. And Columbo was asked to attend a meeting where Gambino specifically voiced his concerns about what was going on, and Columbo didn't want to fucking hear it. Gambino advised against the league and any rallies associated with it. Columbo once again ignored him. So we can see Carlo Gambino has given him every opportunity to fucking knock this shit off, and he just doesn't. It was after that Gambino told his men and issued the order to other families, you are not to be at any rally, you are not to have anything associated with Joe Columbo whatsoever or his antics. Joe DiCicco, who was a captain within the Gambino crime family, who's also on the board of Columbo's shit show, ended up quitting the Italian League, claiming that he had bad health, but reality is he was told, get the fuck away. Right then, Columbo should have kind of realized there was a problem, and unfortunately, I think he was blinded by his own ideas. June 29th of 1970, Columbo held his first rally. 50,000 people were in attendance. That did not go over well with the commission whatsoever. Post that rally, Columbo then began to attack Ford Motor Company. He began to attack Alka-Seltzer, calling for their boycott on national television. He then went after Macy's for selling a game called The Godfather. If the boycott did any good, it sort of forced the FBI to stop using the word Mafia every 3 seconds for a short period of time. If anything good came from it, it was that. Columbo then goes after Albert S. Ruddy, who was the producer of the Godfather film. At the time, the Godfather was filming in the city and employed a lot of unions, which meant a lot of money to the Mafia. Over the years, the story of the Godfather has been steeped in a lot of horse shit. I just got to be honest with you. While Columbo rallied against the film and demanded that the words Mafia be stricken from the script, it really was a front. On the back end, Russell Bufalino is the one who had discussions with Albert S. Ruddy about the film. And it was Bufalino's power, especially in the unions and in Hollywood, which controlled how those wheels sort of turned. Columbo gets a lot of sort of accolades for that, but it really had nothing to do with him. And it was through Bufalino that the script was revised and sort of Cosa Nostra, La Cosa Nostra were omitted from the screenplay. Like I said, Columbo's been given a lot of credit for that, but it had little to nothing to do with him, to be honest with you. And he essentially used his league as a public platform to lambast anybody who mentioned the word Mafia. It's another misstep for Columbo that infuriated the unions because workers had faced a possibility of being fired for any associations with the Mafia. And therefore, when Bufalino steps in, he reassures Carlo Gambino and the production companies that none of the unions would stall, none of the unions would boycott. And that is, that's one of the things that Columbo wanted. He wanted the unions to boycott the production, which would put a lot of people out of work. A lot of people would lose a lot of fucking money. And Carlo Gambino wasn't going to tolerate it. Bufalino was able to assure everyone that the unions and the production that nothing would be haunted as a result of Columbo's fucking mouth. I meant halted, not haunted. What the fuck? It's almost Halloween. What are you going to do? Then Columbo does another thing. And these are all things that this guy does. So when people tell me, oh, he did nothing wrong, these are things I'm telling you he did fucking wrong. Then he goes on the Dick Cavett show. You can go on YouTube and type in Dick Cavett. I don't know if there's any old shows with Joe Colombo on it, but he goes on a national television show, and that was the last straw for the Mafia. It was enough to just push Carlo Gambino and the rest of the commission over the edge. And it's right then when Gambino fully realizes that Joe Colombo is completely fucking out of control, and that he couldn't be reined in, couldn't be talked to, and he's reached the end of his rope. And then Joey Gallow gets released from prison. Joey Gallow would be released back into the streets in April of 1971. As he was released, his ambitions were pretty much to go back to the streets and wanted to take control of things. Once Gallo was released through middlemen, he was told pretty much through Gambino not to allow Columbo to order demands to him, and that if he needed to, he had the commission's blessing to go to war with Columbo. So now you see Carlo Gambino's pulling the strings on the other end. As Gallo gets released, Columbo realizes that he might have a potential problem with Joey Gallo because there had been bad blood. Columbo really truly wanted peace, and it kept things pretty relatively quiet on that front. So he goes to Joe Iacovelli, who goes to Gallo, and he says, we want to have a sit down. We have a meeting. Gallo goes to the meeting where he meets with Iacovelli and other members of the Colombo crime family. He gets handed $1,000, and he's told, this should keep the peace. Gallo felt disrespected about the money offer and also expected to go completely back into business. But many of the rackets that he controlled were handed over to others within the family while he was gone. So Gallo feels disrespected, and he basically tells Joe Iacovelli, I'm not bound by any fucking peace agreement because when this agreement was made, I was in fucking prison, so I'm not going to accept that. He further demanded that he said, I want $100,000 and I promise you I'll keep the peace. Later on, he's told that Joe Colombo basically told him, fuck off. For Gallo, it meant that war was going to be a factor again in his life. He was going to go to war. Columbo, for his part, wanted Joey Gallo fucking dead and handed the contract to Vincent Alloy to handle, but that he would never get the chance to do that. Columbo just wouldn't stop. Despite all the warnings and concerns, he just kept moving forward. Not only would he not stop his ranting about the FBI, but he refused to disband his league and now was hell-bent on going into another war. Gambino, once again, end of his rope, sees enough and orders Joe Colombo's death. March 11th of 1971, Joe Colombo gets convicted of perjury for lying on his application to become a real estate broker. Colombo gets sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, but the sentence gets delayed due to an appeal. If that doesn't happen, and Colombo goes to prison, he probably wouldn't have been killed. June 28th of 1971, Joe Colombo holds his second Italian Unity rally in Columbus Circle. The streets were littered with people. Many people spoke as Joe Colombo stepped up to the podium to speak. Jerome Johnson, an African-American posing as a news cameraman, stepped up behind him, pumping 3 shots into the back of his fucking head. Seconds later, Colombo henchmen would step in and shoot Jerome Johnson to death. The shooting didn't kill Colombo. It left him paralyzed and pretty much essentially in a coma. He would die 7 years later. After the public hit on Colombo, there were a lot of people within the Colombo crime family who blamed Joey Gallow for the assassination. And it made sense from a certain standpoint. But the reality is that Joey Gallow didn't do it. He really didn't have anything to do with it from a murder aspect. So where did the shooter come from? Some people have claimed it was a Nicky Barnes guy. But the reality is he was a Gambino guy. And a lot of people have not talked about Jerome Johnson. A lot of people don't know what I know. After a lot of research and talking to somebody in New Jersey where he was originally from, not originally from, but where he had lived a lot of part of life. But a lot of people have said that that's not accurate, but I find it hard to believe. And I have some things I need to tell you that'll sort of back this up. The police have stated over the years that Jerome Johnson was a lone nut job, but reality is, somehow he obtained a press pass. You just can't think of the time period we're in. A lot of racism, a lot of this, they're just going to give some black guy a fucking press pass. It's just not possible. But there is so much to the conspiracy of murder, from the FBI doing it, to the Colombo bodyguard, Phil Rosillo pulling the trigger. The police would even blame the murders on a fictitious black militant group, which, the FBI is good at doing, which didn't even exist. The reality is Jerome Johnson had mob ties to both the Colombo crime family and the Gambino crime family. Johnson at one time was a pimp who was used to procure women for a Gambino-run establishments. He was involved in the gay porn scene with Michael Umber, who ran a gay club, which was controlled by Paul DeBella, who was a Gambino heavyweight. In fact, his last known address was at a tenement building owned by DeBella. And some people will say, well, that sounds conspiratorial, but it gets worse. Prior to the murder of Colombo, he had been spotted at clubs owned by DeBella, meeting with high-ranking members of the Gambino crime family. He also told friends that he would be moving to the Caribbean in a week. He had also told others that he won a ton of cash in a craps game, which gave him enough money to head out of the country to start a new life. It's worth noting that Johnson was essentially destitute, yet somehow managed to buy his mother's house a week before the murder of Joe Colombo. In fact, after Jerome Johnson's funeral, North Brunswick newspaper columnists looked into Jerome Johnson's financial records. When he died, he had $2.05 to his fucking name in his bank account. How does he buy a house when he only has $2 in his bank account? And he bought his mother's house in New Bedford. I think what is apparent is that the Gambinos handled the heavy work here, and they found somebody willing to kill Colombo for the right price. Gambino played it the right way. He pushed Gallo into a possible war with Colombo, and at the same time pressed ahead with the murder of Colombo. Both Gambino and Gallo would be picked up and asked questions about the murder of Colombo. Both denied any wrongdoing, and neither one was charged. After the murder of Joe Colombo, there was an emergency meeting within the Colombo crime family. At that meeting, it was suggested that Salvatore Mineo take over the crime family as boss. But Mineo took his name off the list because he felt that he was old and in frail health. But in reality, I think he saw the writing on the wall. He knew what the fuck was going on. I think he also knew that Gambino was probably behind the move, and he didn't want to be killed. And I don't know who's to blame him. There was also dissension within the ranks of the Colombo crime family to begin with. He knew the direction that the Colombo crime family was probably heading, and so Mineo suggests at the meeting that Joe Iacovelli become the next boss of the family. Iacovelli would accept the role as boss, and many in the crime family felt that Joey Gallow was behind the murder of Colombo, and they wanted him dead. They wanted retribution. The police early on did suspect Gallow, but they didn't believe that he ended up doing it, and they, in fact, actually followed Joey Gallow really close for months and months and months to make sure that nobody could enact revenge on him. Joey Gallow, for his part, though, had the backing of Gambino. Gambino essentially used Joey Gallo to present problems to Gambino. Gallo began to take a little turf back here and there, but also began to hang out with the Hollywood crowd, which included Jerry Orbach, noted poets, celebrities, and that move showed that Gallo really just couldn't be controlled either, and that he was probably going to become a problem as well. As 1972 wound down, the murder of Joe Colombo really began to sort of dissipate from the news cycle. Police stopped kind of looking at it, and officially a contract at that point was placed on Joey Gallo's head. April 7th of 1972 at around 4:30 in the morning, Joey Gallo was celebrating his birthday at Umberto's Clam House in Manhattan. According to Colombo associate Joe Luparelli, he spotted Gallo sitting in the restaurant and bar. He ends up leaving without being noticed, walks a couple of blocks to a Colombo-run social club. And when he gets there, he contacts Joe Iacovelli on the phone about, hey, I know where Joey Gallo is. And then allegedly, according to Luparelli, he recruits Phil Gambino and Carmine DiBiase and two other members of the patriarchal crime family to kill Joey Gallo. According to Luparelli, he sat in the car while four others entered the restaurant through the back door. According to Luparelli, the gunmen entered with guns blazing, opened fire using a snub-nosed .38 and a .32 caliber revolver. 20 shots were allegedly fired. Gallo gets hit in the back, elbow, and ass. Gallo then gets up, overturns a table, draws his gun, then decides to make a run for the door. Gallo then allegedly stumbles out the door and falls on the ground dead. While that's one version of the dozen reported versions of this event, of Gallo's demise, the NYPD never bought that. Police, realizing the story wasn't accurate from any standpoint whatsoever, at least from an evidentiary standpoint, then released a false narrative about the shooting. And the reason why they did that was they wanted to combat all the lies and different stories being told. They also had a suspicion that the Colombo crime family was making shit up, and that essentially the Colombos sent Luparelli there to make up shit. Many over the years have stated that they believe that Luparelli's statements were devised by the Colombo crime family in an attempt to throw the police off the scent of the murder. On a side note to that, Umberto's was a Genovese-controlled place. So any murder that is going to take place in a Genovese-controlled place had to have been green-lighted. So in other words, whoever was behind it had to reach out to the Genoveses for permission to use that as a hit spot. You just can't, you can't do that under 10 minutes. You mean to believe this guy walks into Umberto's, oh shit, that's Joey Gallo. Oh, let me run 2 blocks and call 2 guys. And why would there be 2 patriarchal guys in New York City that night? It doesn't pass the smell test for me. It just doesn't. And so then you have the whole Frank Sheeran version of events. What is interesting about that is Frank Sheeran claimed to have killed Joey Gallo, and the description of the scene matches what the NYPD knew about the murder. In addition to that, 2 witnesses did come forward, and they clearly identified Frank Sheeran as the man they saw in Umberto's that night. Joey Gallo's widow, just to compare and contrast here, years later would describe multiple shooters being short in stature and Italian-looking, which, depending on, how you want to look at that, it could have been using a deflection to take off a Sheeran, or that's what I think likely was the case here. It's either that or she lied to the cops. She wasn't being honest. Luparelli, who was allegedly in on the hit, allegedly got so scared that he was going to get killed that he runs to the FBI with information. But the problem is nothing that he said matched up with what witnesses saw or what the evidence showed. 3 days after Gallo gets killed, Gennaro Ciprio gets killed. Ciprio was a spy for the Gallo crew, was playing both sides, and he ends up getting shot coming out of his restaurant in Brooklyn. Even more suspect was that Ciprio was very tight with Joe Colombo and was actually standing next to him when he gets shot by Johnson. Even stranger than that, in 1972, a few months prior to his death, he was indicted for securities fraud with none other than Greg Scarpa. So there's a lot of different playing vehicles here. There is no way to tell who killed Joey Gallo. We can debate that for years. The reality is it really doesn't matter who killed him at the end of the day. The fact remains he got killed for several fucking reasons. Gambino could have protected Gallo. He could have transferred Gallo from the Colombos to the Gambinos. Surely he knew that Gallo was going to get killed, and he did nothing to stop it, which tells you he was in on it. Gallo allowed himself in many ways to be used by Carlo Gambino. Gambino's bottom line was to force Colombo out by any means necessary, and he had the perfect patsy in the waiting room. The reality that Johnson was actually a Gambino-connected guy makes all the sense in the world. Maybe Gambino promised him something down the line for being a good steward of the Mafia. We're never going to know. So as a result of Joey Gallow's murder, Albert Gallo goes apeshit. He takes off and goes out to Las Vegas, and he wants to kill Joe Iacovelli, Alphonse Persico, and Jerry Langella. The shooters, and this is where they get the moniker, the gang that couldn't shoot straight. Shooters entered a diner where the men were sitting. They didn't recognize Iacovelli, Persico, and Langella, and they shot 3 fucking innocent people. They shot the wrong goddamn people. The attempted hit on them scared the shit out of Joe Iacovelli, and he ends up taking off. And with Mineo retired, the Colombos didn't have a boss. And that's all Carmine Persico needed to hear. He was a powerful captain within the crime family. Word was sent back to him in prison because at the time he was doing a bid on federal hijacking charges. So then the vacuum ends up getting filled by Vincent Alloy. And that wouldn't last because he gets convicted of perjury on June 26 of 73 for lying to a grand jury when he claimed that he had not visited a Colombo family safe house in Nyack, New York, prior to the Joey Gallo murder. Out on bail, he sees the writing on the wall. He steps down as boss. And so one of the more interesting things, before we wrap all this up, is you can see the treachery from beginning to end. And a lot of people have always speculated Joey Gallo fired the shots. He set up the hit. I don't really think that's the case. I think that Jerome Johnson was a Gambino front guy. Not an associate. He was a guy they knew that because he worked in different clubs and did different things for them, that he would do it. They gave him a ton of money, obviously, and that was his way. But I don't think he ever, you know what? I think about that hit. If there's 5,000, 10,000 people in a crowd, you pull a trigger, odds are you might be able to get away. But reality is he didn't. And nobody was ever charged with his murder, which I find a little circumspect. And so we see how behind the scenes Carlo Gambino sort of manipulates things. He could have protected Joey Gallo, and I think at the end of the day, the reason why he didn't was because he realized that Joey Gallo was just going to do what he wanted to do. But it would have been interesting to see if Gambino had transferred Gallo over to the Gambinos and what would have happened. So, when we come back next week, it's going to be the rise of the snake, Carmine Persico. The Colombos are about to have some big fucking problems. The chess pieces are going to have to move around, and they're going to move around real quick. The snake enters the fray, and wars will begin. So when we come back next week on Mob Talk Radio, we are going to get into part 4 of the Colombo crime family history. And you know what's about to happen. We got Greg Scarpa. We got Carmine Persico. Things are about to get fucking nuttier than a shithouse loon. I wanted to thank everybody for listening in today. I'm obviously getting fucking sick. I hope I don't have the fucking COVID. Christ's sakes. I've gotten sicker as the show is going on. This is like fucking garbage. I'm sure you could tell by my voice. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week with an all-new show. Once again, share my show if you can. That's all I ever ask. Have a great one. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are talking the Colombo crime family history part 4. Now, last week, I told you that I thought we would get to Greg Scarpa this week. We're not going to, because there's a lot that transpires in a short amount of time. And one of the things I didn't want to do was I didn't want to get halfway into like Greg Scarpa or even to Vic Arena and then leave you high and dry until next week. And I'd like to put all the action together. So there may not be a lot of action, but there's a lot of things that sort of take place in a short relative period of time that I want to discuss. So we talked last week about all the scheming behind the scenes with Joey Gallo, with Carlo Gambino, and the eventuality of what would become of Joey Gallo and what happened to him. And we sort of left off with Carmine Persico sitting in jail, and Vincent Alloy stepping down from the leadership fairly quickly after getting convicted on a perjury charge. He would get out, but he would step down from the throne. Joe Brancato, who was John Sonny Francis's captain, would then sort of step into the role as boss for the Colombo crime family. Francis likely would have been probably named boss. Let's just be honest. He probably would have been, but Francis was off to Leavenworth for a 50-year pinch for bank robbery, And it's a crime that I think that Sonny Francis was really framed for. You got to remember, a lot of people, Sonny Francis was a tough guy. I don't think anybody's going to tell you any different. But I also think that he spent most of his career in prison. So I think people make a mountain out of a molehill in certain kind of ways. He's a tough guy, a no-nonsense guy, a feared guy. But he was in jail more than he was on the streets. And I think the legends sort of are made of people in certain portions where they shouldn't be. And I'm not saying anything disparaging about Sonny Francis, God rest his soul. But I just think in reality, when somebody's in jail longer than they're on the streets, the legends sort of grow. And I'll just leave it at that. And for those that think I'm going to talk about Michael Francis, you're out of your fucking mind. I may get to a point where we talk about the gas scheme and some other things like that, but not this week. Brancato takes over, but he doesn't even last very long either. He stood in basically long enough to try to broker a deal between the Gallo crew and whatever was left of the Colombos at the time. One of the agreements that he came up with was that the remainder of the Gallo crew would transfer over to the Genovese crime family. The Genovese crime family would accept that, and they would transfer Albert Gallo and the rest of his crew over there. And that would pretty much essentially end the Gallo war with the Colombo crime family. Brancato would then step down as acting boss of the family, and he returned to his crew, which their base of operations was on Long Island. In 1973, with nobody else really itching to become boss, Carmine Persico essentially pretty much takes over as boss. He names Alley Boy Persico the acting boss, Jerry Lang, also known as Gennaro Langella, his underboss, and then they would have support from Teddy Persico, who had just been arrested just prior to all of this. We talked last week about, Carmine and how he came up, and I don't want to regurgitate all of that. But before heading to prison, Persico really was one of the biggest and most profitable captains of a crew for the Colombo crime family in the history of the mob. No joke. He wasn't on Tony Salerno's level, but he was on a level that was big. Persico, he was a hands-on captain. He was seen nonstop. And that's one of the differences between, say, him and Tony Salerno. Tony Salerno, he could have been seen at a social club, talking with guys, but Carmine was a hands-on guy. That's just the way he was. He wasn't the type to sit back, and sort of bark instructions to other guys to repeat to other guys. If he was going to bark, he was going to bark himself. And he relied on being seen, and he relied on being heard. And there is a pro to that, and there's a con to that. The con to that is you get seen by the feds and rats and whatever else. The pro to that is not relying on other people to do your bidding. He would step into labor racketeering, which lasted from the 1940s until now, especially after we saw the indictment of all the Colombos a couple of weeks ago. That's never really ended, and it's miraculous when you consider how many decades they've been doing this. I mean, 1940s to now, that's fucking insane. It's 80 some years. That's crazy. It's never ended. Persico dug his heel into the unions to labor racketeering, loan sharking, gambling. And he doesn't hesitate to volunteer his crew or even himself for murder for hire. So, he pretty much had his hands in everything. By the late 1960s, Persico's crew had become one of the most profitable crew in the Colombo crime family. And like we said last week, Persico would, ended up getting hemmed up in 1968 for federal hijacking. And after 5 trials, which went back to 1960, in 1972 and 73, he would finally be sent to prison for an 8-year term. In that case, Joe Valachi would end up testifying against him. So as Persico enters the system, Alley Boy would exit almost at the same time, which is why Alley Boy got the bump up in promotion, and it was another way for Carmine Persico to control the narrative, which Carmine Persico did his whole entire life from prison. Gennaro Langella was a violent member of the Colombo crime family, grew up in Brooklyn with Carmine, and they were lifelong friends. Langella was specifically known for control of the unions, narcotics, and loan sharking. He totally controlled unions with an iron fist, especially the laborers' local 6A. And he would be the point man for the Colombos in the Concrete Club. Jerry Lang was, really the point guy in a lot of different rackets for the Colombo crime family. And while Carmine was away in prisons, especially, In 1979, Carmine Persico steps out of prison, but by 1981 ends up getting pinched again for racketeering and conspiracy charges. He would be sentenced to another 5-year term in prison. The feds essentially had Carmine Persico on a wiretap, offering an IRS agent $250,000 to help him get out of prison early. So, as you can see with Carmine, it seems to be Carmine gets out, Carmine goes back. Carmine gets out, Carmine goes back. One of the more interesting things that I would probably bank on what most of you are thinking right now is, wait a second, you mean to tell me that this doesn't have Carmine on the streets the entire time? No, absolutely not. Carmine spent most of his tenure in the 1960s until his death in prison. He was another one that was in the can more than he was on the streets. And in case you didn't know, I mean, he ruled with an iron fist. And I could talk, and I could tell you this personally about Carmine as I knew him. Okay. And when I say I knew him, we weren't best pals. We didn't send each other fucking birthday cards. But we knew some of the same people in prison. And I talked frequently with Carmine Persico when he was in prison, once a week usually. And this was specifically when he was doing time down in Butner, North Carolina. He was a funny guy. But he was a quiet guy, serious guy, but he's not what you would expect, to be honest with you. Once again, we talk about humanizing people. He seemed to me more grandfatherly than gangster. He was unassuming, but don't get it twisted. He was still a dangerous guy. And I felt shitty when, he applied to get out of prison. And I feel bad that I didn't help out more with any attempts to facilitate that. But when I think of when the history vault closes, he's probably going to be one of the longest reigning bosses from behind bars in the history of the Mafia. And that takes some moxie, let me tell you. And for any sort of conversation that we ever had was very loose. We didn't talk criminal shit, just life shit. And I learned a lot from him, and he was a good guy, at least in my dealings with him. He was always a friendly person, never said anything bad about anybody, didn't even take the stance of fuck the feds. I think he just came to a resolute sort of decision of, this is what it is. I am where I am at, and, the rest is sort of history. So Carmine ends up heading back to prison, and trouble was brewing. On February 25th of 1985, the commission trial would drop. Paul Castellano, Anthony Salerno, Tony Dux Corallo, Rusty Rostelli, Neil Della Croce, Jerry Lang, Salvatore Santoro, Christy Ticfunari, Ralph Scopo, Carmine Persico, Stefano Capono, Anthony Indelicato all get indicted by Rudy Giuliani, that fucking Giuliani. Prick. Persico, who had gotten out of prison just prior to this, got a tip off about the indictment that was coming down, and he did what a lot of people do. He gets in the wind. He gets in the wind. He flew the coop. He just got in the wind fucking immediately. By October, the FBI was on the hunt for Persico. He would make the list of the FBI's most wanted at number 390, which, how wanted can you be if you're number 390 on the fucking list? Fuck out of here. Carmine would head to Hempstead, New York, shuffling between his cousin's house. His cousin was a guy by the name of Fred DeChristopher, and other people, but Fred DeChristopher ended up, what a piece of shit. He's a rat fuck. Carmine didn't know that DeChristopher had been supplanting information to the FBI for over 2 years after he got caught in a sting operation. And he pretty much tipped the feds off of where Carmine was hiding. The feds would do DeChristopher a favor, and they would use a false narrative to arrest both Persico and DeChristopher, and he ends up going on to testify. And they only did that to save DeChristopher's life, and he would end up going on to testify against Carmine Persico. How could a cousin testify against another cousin? How the fuck can you even do that? Like, morally. Anyway, Persico would be apprehended on February 15th of 1985. On July 1st, Persico and others indicted would plead not guilty along with 11 others. Back in 1983, the FBI had begun recording several conversations between gangsters, which would come back to haunt the entire commission. Ralph Scopo would be taped shaking down contractors. At the time, Ralph Scopo was the alleged president of the Cement and Concrete Workers District Council of the Laborers International Union in North America from 1977 through 85. Scopo was using basically his position in the union to extort money from cement contractors in New York in return for large construction contracts and assuring labor peace. If they didn't go along with it, the labor would strike. There you go. Typically, contracts between $3 to $16 million were reserved for the Concrete Club. We've talked about the Concrete Club, so I don't want to regurgitate that. In return, the contractors would kick back 2% of the contract value to the commission. But I've heard other things, and I heard it was actually closer to 5%, which would make a little more sense to me. Jerry Lang's role in the scheme was to supervise the different labor rackets for the Mafia, specifically the Colombo crime family. He oversaw the Colombo stake in the Concrete Club and would exert total control over the labor unions, which included Cement and Concrete Workers District Council Local 6A, like we said earlier. Tony Salerno, the front boss at the time of the Genovese crime family, would have hidden interest in many different contract companies, and he mainly siphoned money from the S&A Concrete Company and the Transit Mix Concrete Corporation. Tony Ducks Corallo, on the other hand, pretty much destroyed the entire Mafia with his fucking mouth when he was caught on wiretaps complaining to Sal Avellino about Paul Castellano penny pinching, griping about money, and that he thought Castellano was taking more than his share's worth of the Concrete Club. Also on those tapes, Tony Ducks Corallo discussed a beef with Robert Kubeka. And Kubeka was involved in the garbage hauling business on Long Island. He had his own company, and when Tony Corallo wanted him to sort of get involved with some scheming and some other things and wanted some kickbacks. Basically Tony Corallo leaned on Kubeka, and rather than Kubeka act complicit or get involved, he runs right to the goddamn feds. Pussy. Kubeka would then become a government informant, agreed to tape mobsters trying to shake him down and get him involved in various schemes. And while those tapes didn't really offer a ton of evidence, it gave the feds enough information to wiretap Sal Avellino's phone. While those wiretaps, this is the hypocrisy or the ludicrousness of all of this, is each thing leads to another. So if Avellino and Corallo aren't talking, they don't get tapped. If Kubeka doesn't run, they don't even know that Avellino and Corallo are even talking. Then they tap Avellino's home, and they really don't get anything out of that other than to find out that they get the golden turd here. And the golden turd is they realize that Avellino every day is driving Corallo around town. And what car they're using. And so what do? They bug Corallo's Jaguar. Those conversations would bury the commission. They would prove the existence of the commission and how it functioned. Corallo's big mouth got everybody indicted. Corallo would explain the structure of the commission, how it worked, the beef with other crime families, the heads of other crime families, and everything in between. Those conversations proved to Rudy Giuliani, piece of shit, that the commission... Did anybody else find it hilarious that he did a press conference outside of a dildo shop? Am I the only one that was cracking up about that? Anyway, those conversations proved to Giuliani that the commission did truly in fact exist, and that internal beefs between families over the labor unions and concrete schemes, it just buried the entire commission. There wasn't much they could do, and as we've stated before on this show, Giuliani had already been looking into the Mafia for a while. He wanted a big case. He had political aspirations. But it was through Joe Bonanno's book, which basically laid the groundwork for the commission and in its existence and how it kind of operated, which gave Giuliani sort of the pathway of which way to go. And later on down the line, Joe Bonanno's son, Bill Bonanno, was locked up. He was shipped over to Altoona, which is where the Joe Valachi suite is located in Texas. And that's where they send all the big informants, and Bonanno gave up even more information about the commission and its function and about other bosses. That would be furthered by a meeting between Rudy Giuliani and Joe Bonanno, where Bonanno, in fact, doubled down on the history of the commission and explained even further how it worked. So between Joe and Bill Bonanno and the tapes from Corallo, it was enough for Giuliani to just pretty much decimate everybody. Legend sort of has it that JohnGotti and Carmine Persico had discussions about wanting to kill Rudy Giuliani for a multitude of reasons. But that information was obviously provided by Greg Scarpa, who would have been become a federal informant back in the 60s. But I don't believe that to ever really be the case, because I'm going to be honest with you, Persico didn't like John Gotti. I know for a fact because he told me so. How he told me, what he told me, maybe I'll share someday. But he wasn't fond of John Gotti. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that John Gotti put it on the street that Carmine Persico was a fucking rat, which wasn't true. So I think Scarpa made up a lot of stuff too. But anyway, the idea that the murder of Giuliani was sort of put to the commission of, hey, we want to kill a fucking very public official and a fucking DA, whatever the case may be, it's as ridiculous as it gets. And I don't believe a word of it. So the charges would stem from narcotics trafficking to labor union racketeering, gambling, extortion, loan sharking, and more. Neil Della Croce would actually avoid trial because he would die of cancer on December 2nd of 1985. Not 13 days later, Paul Castellano and Tommy Bellotti get murdered outside of Sparks Steakhouse in a hostile takeover designed by the one and only Teflon Don, John Gotti. Rusty Rastelli's charges would be dropped, and this is very important, as a result because of wiretaps. And the government found out through wiretaps that the Bonanno crime family no longer had a seat on the commission due to Joe Pistone and just some other things that went on. Therefore, Rastelli could not be charged with acting complicit as a commission member. What makes that all the more frustrating for me is that the FBI knew that Tony Salerno was also not the boss of the Genovese crime family. They had tapes where Tony Salerno was caught looking over an induction list with names for another family. And on that tape, Tony is heard saying, I don't recognize any of these fucking names. Just send the list up to the boss. It proves he wasn't the boss. That acknowledgement and proof that Salerno was only boss in name. And that's all it is. And we all know, he was just an acting front boss for the Genovese crime family, and that Vincent the Gingigante was the actual boss. So why the government neglected to mention that until after the fact is a little fucked up. The same could be said for Carmine Persico, because at the time he was in prison, while he might have been the boss behind the scenes, the government knew that Langella and Allie Boy were essentially running the family. My only guess is that because Salerno, for instance, had controlling interests in different concrete companies, is what made him pliable to the stance that he was a boss. But the reality is, we know, we've said it a million times, we know and they know that he was just an acting boss. But I think the fact that they could not prove that Vinny Gigante was the head of anything, that's probably why they settled on Salerno, just to be honest with you. And I guess it really doesn't matter truly at the end of the fucking day, because Tony Corallo if he doesn't get caught blabbing all over his fucking car, then probably none of it happens the way that it really went down. And it's worth noting that Vinny the Fish Cafaro, a couple months was become a rat, and he even stated that Tony Salerno wasn't a fucking the boss. So if you know the guy is not the boss, then I just wonder why there was never sort of a fucking appeal to that. There should have been. Anyway, the attorneys for the defendants knew that their clients really didn't have much of a chance at trial. They instructed them to listen to plea agreements, and perhaps they wouldn't do life in prison. As the plea agreements from Giuliani began to sort of filter back to the defendants, one of the conditions was that they all had to admit they were in the Mafia, that the Mafia existed, and that they had to admit to the most serious charges in the indictment. So what the fuck is the point of a plea agreement? Usually a plea agreement means you're going to admit to certain things, you're going to plead guilty to certain things, and you're going to get a less amount of time. Not in this case. Why they would even consider admitting to the most serious of the charges, it's ridiculous to me. But Persico, for whatever reason, decided that he wanted to defend himself. The move made other mobsters in the indictment absolutely fucking irate, but they, quickly tried to separate themselves from Persico, meaning they wanted to be separated and tried differently because they didn't want anything that Carmine had to say to fuck them. They believed that he didn't really have any fucking clues to what he was doing. They tried desperately to sever themselves. The judge wouldn't hear it, and Persico would go on to defend himself, and he actually defended himself quite well at trial. One of the things Persico did, which turned many heads, was to admit that the Mafia did exist, and he admitted that there were bosses, there were underbosses, but that being a boss of a group was not a crime. Being a member of a group was not a crime. That was the first time that it had ever been done. And while that's accurate, and we still see that defense used today, it damaged Persico and the defendants in the case. Let's just call a spade a spade. It's just something that you just don't admit to, and you just don't give credence to. The defendants would follow Persico with that idea, And they admitted the same thing, basically thinking that it could help them in the long run. And lawyers kind of thought that it was a good idea too. They would be on board as long as they personally didn't have to say if the mafia existed. So they could say, I'm a member of a group, but they did not want to admit that they were members of the actual mafia itself. And they didn't want to admit that the mafia was actually a real thing. In the opening statement in trial, Sal Santoro's lawyer would state, the mafia exists, but you cannot accept that just because a person is a member of the mafia, that does not mean he committed crimes that are charged in this case. And it was really the first time in the history of organized crime that the mafia or the existence of the mafia in a courtroom was admitted in open court. Bad decision. I don't know what the fuck the lawyers were thinking. I would have, if I was a lawyer, I would not advise my client to admit to anything. And the move of doing that, I guess the thought process on that would be, well, maybe if you admit to it, maybe it'll lessen some of the damage, but that, I think it just backfired completely. The fact that Giuliani could tie the defendants to the commission pretty much was enough to bury them. And on November 19th of 1986, 7 defendants were found guilty and would be sentenced accordingly on January 13th of 1987, which included Carmine Persico and Jerry Langella, who would be sentenced to 100 years in prison. There would be a secondary Colombo trial with other crimes attached, different RICO laws or predicate acts, and Langella would receive an additional 56 years and Carmine Persico 39 years, taking Langella's sentence to 156 years, Persico's to 139 years. Alphonse Persico would also be sentenced in that case to 12 years in prison. And this is how the commission trial sentencing went. Anthony Salerno, alleged boss of the Genovese crime family, 100 years in prison and a $240,000 fine. Tony Dux Corallo, alleged boss of the Lucchese's, 100 years, $240,000 fine. Salvatore Santoro, 100 years, $250,000 fine, alleged underboss of the Lucchese's. Christy Ticfonari, alleged consigliere of the Lucchese's, 100 years, $240,000 fine. Carmine Persico, alleged boss of the Colombo crime family, 100 years, $240,000 fine. Ralph Scopo, 100 years, $240,000 fine, and he was just a lowly soldier in the Colombo crime family. Gennaro Langella, 100 years, $240,000 fine. He was alleged to be the acting underboss of the Colombo crime family. Anthony Indelicato, 40 years, $50,000 fine. He was an alleged captain of the Bonanno crime family, and he is getting out soon. Let me tell you, he's finally going to get out. It's worth noting that at a trial further down the line, like I said earlier, that mob rat Vincent the Fish Cafaro would testify in open court that Anthony Salerno was not the boss of the Genovese crime family, rather that Vinny the Chin Gigante was the actual boss. Noted author Selwyn Rabb, in his book The Five Families, argued that Cafaro's testimony wouldn't change the dynamic for Salerno because he had been charged with specific acts, not for being the boss. However, I totally agree with him, because the log jam of the indictment was all about who was the boss, and it was the commission. Okay? If Rabb wants to use that argument, then why was Rusty Rastelli's charges dropped? Do you see what I'm saying? So when they realized that the Bonannos had lost a seat on the commission, then they let those charges go. So his argument just completely is torn apart. So while I respect Selwyn Rabb as an author and a historian of the Mafia, I don't buy his fucking argument. I just really don't. So let's see. As far as Persico acting as his own attorney, he really didn't do a bad job. He defended himself well. But the reality is that there was a mountain of evidence and wiretaps, and nobody was going to beat that case. I don't care what you say. At Persico's sentencing, the judge actually complimented Persico on his ability to defend himself and suggested that if he had chosen another path in life, he might have been a decent attorney. How the others felt about that, I'm not really sure. But what is introspective here is that Persico's age at sentencing, he was only 53 when he was sentenced. Had he bypassed the trial or not been a part of it, considering most other bosses at the time were in their 70s, excluding Vinny Gigante, of course, Persico probably would have been a very, very long-reigning boss of the Colombos. Especially considering the age of 53 at the time, and he would have been on the streets another some 30 fucking years if fate sort of didn't intervene. But let's be honest, Carmine Persico had a run of the shits nonstop. 5 out, in prison 5, out 2, in for 10, out for 1. I mean, some guys have the fucking worst luck. So, as Carmine heads to prison, he names Alley Boy Persico the new boss of the Colombo. Excuse me, the Colombo. Oh, jeez, Colombo. I'm gonna get fucking in trouble for that. Now they're gonna say I'm like fucking making fun of Asian people or something. Never mind the speech impediment I fucking have. Carmine heads to prison. He names Alphonse Persico the new boss of the Colombo crime family, but Alphonse ends up getting into a fucking jam. He ends up skipping out on bail, and Persico has no other choice but to install a three-man ruling panel. It's not the first time he's going to do it. He installs Benedetto Alloy, Vinny Angelino, and Joe Tomasello, but that wouldn't last, and Persico would officially disband the three-member ruling panel somewhere between 1987 and 88. Many people report that Joe Waverly would take over as boss, but that's not accurate. It was actually Vic Arena who essentially would take over as acting boss in interim basis. Joe Waverly at the time was the front boss, or at least in that sort of type of situation. Vic Arena was born in New York in August of 1934, and by many accounts, he was a bit of a troublemaker at a young age. He would end up going to reform school as a kid for fighting and other things. He would eventually drop out of high school and would enter a life of crime. It's been said that Arena grew up around mob guys and like the glitz and glamour of it all. And he would make his way into the Mafia life. In the early 1970s, as the books for induction or new members were closed by Carlo Gambino, Persico secretly went against that and made over a dozen guys, which was against Gambino's rules. But he did it anyway, and Vic Arena was one of the ones that were made in the Colombo crime family. Arena had been rising in the ranks in Brooklyn. Arena's base of operations was out of Brooklyn and Long Island and parts of New Jersey. He was known as a fearsome guy, a smart guy, a capable guy. His rackets included labor racketeering, extortion, gambling, drug trafficking, and even gun running, as well as being a pirate, because that's essentially what pirates do, right? As well as loan sharking and prostitution. Arena was a major moneymaker for the Colombo crime family, so the natural ascension to the top makes sense in every way. However, Arena had other ideas of how to run a crime family. As Arena took over the day-to-day operations of the Colombo crime family, he would begin to conduct direct business with the Gambino crime family. Persico gave Arena the power to induct people, and he gave him the power to kill at his own discretion, which at the time was not something that you often saw a boss sort of give an acting boss permission to do. Normally, everything had to pass through the sitting boss of a family, but Persico essentially gave Arena carte blanche, but he makes it known to Arena that you're only temporary, because as soon as Alley Boy gets out of prison, he's going to be the boss, and you're going to go back to whatever you was doing. And a lot of the reason that Persico picked Arena to begin with was because of his business acumen, his leadership abilities, but also because Arena was in Alley Boy's crew. So there was that sort of connection. And I'm going to stop the part 4 today. And the reason why is Arena's going to start to get fucking a little ballsy, and Persico's going to get pissed, and then Scarpa's going to enter the fray, and everybody's going to start killing each other again. We're going to head to another war. And I just don't want to start that and have you guys, left. Because listen, by 1991, Arena begins to make certain move, which is going to create the Third Colombo War, which is going to bring, like I said, Greg Scarpa into the mix. Carmine will attempt to regain control of his own crime family from prison. We know that Arena is going to pull captains to make a run for the top, which is to create mayhem, and it's going to create mayhem in a million different ways. You will see that many of the same parameters that we have seen so many times before when we talk about crime families and the differences between mob politics and street politics. And we're going to see them, sort of crash in the middle, creating a fucking huge war that is going to change the trajectory of the Colombo crime family for years. Like I said, I could have gone down that road today, but I don't want to get halfway and then put you back in the mix next week and have people miss out. So I'd rather leave it to stormy skies, call it a cliffhanger if you want, and not the kind of cliffhanger where Nicky Scarfo was dropping a horse off the cliff either. So next week we know what's coming, right? Major mayhem and murder. And so I'm going to close out this week's show. I wanted to thank everybody for listening in. I hope you learned something from anything I said. Any complaints, grievances, or threats, you can send them to mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com, and I'll make sure that I get that. I want everybody to have a safe weekend. Go out and enjoy the fucking weather. It's fucking October, one of my favorite times of the year. And we'll be back next week with an all-new show, part 5 of the Colombo crime family, another Q&A, and a bunch of other tidbits. So other than that, I guess the best way to sort of end this show is go fuck yourself.